The breath is essential, right? It's our kind of life force. If we don't breathe, that's it. It's the first thing we do when we come into the world, and the last thing we do when we leave. It's something we do 24,000 times a day, but very rarely give thought to. We're time poor, but we're actually moment rich. You can look for those little opportunities in your day to check in and say, how am I breathing in this moment? Actually, there are loads of opportunities.
Hey guys, and welcome back to another exciting episode of Catch Ups in My Kitchen with me, Georgia Simmons, host of the podcast. This podcast is about all things food, health and wellness, and in my kitchen this week, I am joined by Simon Lamb to talk all things breathwork, Qigong, connecting with our bodies and also connecting with nature. All these things sound so simple, but we are so disconnected from ourselves and our surroundings that it's important to sometimes check in and go back to basics. We always look for external ways to find answers, but actually our body has all the answers it needs. We just need to find a way to tune in order to receive them. So in this episode, we talk about how to do that through a mixture of different things, from breathwork to cold water therapy to Qigong, and just kind of listening to our bodies and the power that that has. I honestly think you're going to love this episode. I really, really did. So please enjoy, and as always, please keep supporting the podcast. Follow, subscribe, share this episode with a friend, check us out on Instagram. All these small little things make the world of difference. So if you haven't clicked that follow button, please do. Thank you so much in advance and enjoy the episode. Simon, welcome to my kitchen. How are you?
I'm very well, thanks, Georgia. Yeah.
Good. Do you mind giving a quick elevator pitch? Who you are and what you do?
Yeah, it's tricky that, isn't it? In a nutshell, it's interesting. I've always struggled with that question because it's the first question, right? That in any setting, like, and what do you do? And it's like, wow, I need to get that into a pitch. But I would say I work in nature connection in a few different ways. So I try and connect people with the natural world, and I do that through teaching breathwork and Qigong. So that kind of connection with the nature within, and then I do it as a coach. So I work one-to-one with people and also with groups, facilitating kind of experiences in the natural world, and then also as a writer and occasionally a photographer as well, where I kind of capture the human story of it.
Love that. Nature connection is probably a really good way to sum that up, and I feel like it's interesting because it's probably the one thing that we are kind of actually most disattached from nowadays, which we'll get into. But I have a quick fire round about all things food just to kick things off.
Okay.
So, cook in or eat out?
Cooking.
What is your favourite restaurant in London?
Oh, good question. I'm going to say Panella, which is a Sicilian street food restaurant.
It's on my list. Is that Borough?
It's on the Goulburn Road where I live, and it's run by Giuseppe, I'm saying that wrong, and Caterina's wife, who came over from Sicily, and it's just wicked. They just do lunch and they're under the Trellick Tower, and it's beautiful Italian home cooked food.
It's actually on my list. I need to go, but it looks amazing, but I haven't been. And what is your go-to Deliveroo?
Oh, good question. Probably Japanese, or if I'm feeling a bit naughty, I would have a Bleecker burger because they're insanely good and they travel really well.
Fair. Go-to cuisine?
Probably Italian. I have a bit of a love affair with Italy. My grandfather was there during the war, and just as kids we were always just introduced to the magic of Italy. So
it is amazing.
Italian food.
And go-to fridge or cupboard staple, which isn't the basics?
A fridge or cupboard staple? As in what I have in my fridge.
What's always in there? Yeah, it's always in the fridge or always in the cupboard.
Actually, at the moment, I've got quite a lot of products from Woolies in there. Because my friend works for Woolies, and one day I came home and I had a massive box, and I was like, what the hell is this? And it was a kind of taster kit of every product they've got.
They've got some good ones.
Yeah, they've got some great ones, and he hadn't told me, and so that was a nice gift. So I've been drinking a lot of these little beetroot shots at the moment.
Nice, love it. Probably needed right now. And what is your favourite dish to cook at home?
Very good question. My go-to would probably be a pasta dish. Like, try and make a really well-made carbonara, but very easy to get that wrong, and it becomes an omelette, and so scrambled kind of eggs.
Nice.
So, but yeah, done well, I love a carbonara.
I always think that like you can't get a pasta dish that tastes as nice as what you can make at home. I just feel like, I know we're speaking about some good Italians, but like I just think that you can just add so many more things into a dish at home than you can in a restaurant. Like I always want to add extra toppings or add extra things.
I know, but they would have us up in Naples for that, I think.
They would crucify us for that.
Yeah.
Okay, I want to start off with a big question, which is the power of the breath. So how powerful is it, and how important is breathing?
Yeah, I think the breath is essential, right? It's our kind of life force. If we don't breathe, that's it. It's the first thing we do when we come into the world, and the last thing we do when we leave. And there's a kind of beauty that it's the thread that's always there with us. And yeah, I think it's something we do 24,000 times a day, but very rarely give thought to. And it has the power in kind of a few minutes to change like our physical state, our mental state, our emotional state. It's the one free tool we have that can do that. And yeah, it's super smart. Like, I guess as our bodies evolved, the breath was the tool that like allowed us to adapt to our environment. So, back in the days when there was the potential threat of a tiger or of a fellow tribe, the breath was the tool that prepared the body. So if you saw the tiger, your breath would shorten and go faster and go heavier, and that would flood you with adrenaline, raise your heart rate, give you some cortisol, get you ready really to have a fight or take flight. And that was really useful in that time. But as we've got further from that, it can kind of lead to like, a dysregulation when we're not understanding how to. But equally, it allows us to regulate in a matter of seconds. So that fight or flight response, we can turn on the opposite, our kind of parasympathetic nervous system, just by regulating our breathing for 1 or 2 minutes. So for me, it's like the tool that is always with me, and probably the one I turn to most in day-to-day life. It
is so funny. It's one of those things that you don't think about, but then when you do think about it, you're like so conscious of it. Like I feel like throughout this whole episode, I'm going to be constantly like, how am I breathing?
Yeah.
But like it is so true. I think when you're stressed, you're naturally taking in shorter breaths, and when you're relaxed, you're probably naturally just taking longer breaths, and it's probably like you don't even think about it, but it's a good way to calm yourself down. I also feel like in London, because we're in a city and it's fast paced, we're probably naturally taking shorter breaths. Like if you were on the tube and suddenly like took a deep, like big deep breath, everyone would be like, are you okay?
Yeah, exactly.
So I think we're probably all naturally also, do you think that COVID and wearing masks affected the way that we now breathe?
I wonder on COVID. It definitely like affected our breath patterns in like probably in many ways. One, it was a super, if you got COVID at any point, it was a like super respiratory kind of based illness. You felt that tightness in there. And then probably the knock on of like this like big sense of anxiety and fear there. And our breath will always kind of mirror our mood, as it were. So like, in the same way we talked about with the tiger, our breath is mirroring that energy there of needing to prepare for a fight or flight. And so, it's really kind of smart in that way, I guess. And it's interesting that you say kind of seeing people. I now can't help but have a look. If you see someone like breathing in a certain pattern. I went to Eckhart Tolle at the Albert Hall, who's amazing and a great hero of mine, and he sat in the middle of the stage for like 2.5 hours, and he had the audience in complete silence. Like, he speaks in this most unbelievable thing, but I couldn't help but notice he was like a massive mouth breather, breathing super short, like in a way that just was like quite at odds with the like deep sense of mindfulness that exists with him, because on the whole, the calmer you are and the more mindful you are, the slower you're going to breathe. And yeah, I guess in London, it's just a super unnatural environment, right? We're always largely in a built environment. We live at a really fast pace. There are like stressors everywhere. I mean, I've cycled for half an hour here, and like, you know, you're avoiding buses and this and that, and so all of that is going to appear in the kind of language of our breath. And yeah, and for me, I think that's just probably inevitable of life here. But the piece that's in our control is that every now and then, as often as we can remember, we can check in with our breath. And like I always say to my clients that we're time poor, but we're actually moment rich. And in a day-to-day life in London, if I said to them, okay, you need to do 20 minutes of breathing every day, they're not going to do it. But if I say you can look for those little opportunities in your day to check in and say, how am I breathing in this moment? Actually, there are loads of opportunities.
This episode is sponsored by Zuki. If, like me, you're interested in supplements and love to feel your best, then you need to try Zuki's range of liposomal supplements. They have been clinically proven to provide 4 times the amount of absorption compared to conventional supplements, which means you feel the benefits faster. They also come in a delicious single-serve sachet, which means you can look forward to taking your supplements every day. My current favourite is vitamin B12, which tastes just like strawberry. If you're interested in trying Zuki, they have given all catch-up listeners a chance to receive a free taster pack. This includes vitamin C, D, B12, collagen, and turmeric. To receive your free pack, click the link in the show notes. Thank you so much, Zuki, for sponsoring the podcast. Now let's get back to the episode.
Like you waiting to collect these coffees, right? Or in the post office queue, or for a friend to turn up, or even walking down the street, you can check in with your breath. And those little sections allow us to turn on that like parasympathetic nervous system enough in the day that counterbalances being in fight or flight like a lot of the time, right? 'Cause
yeah, definitely. I also feel like anxiety and stress is on the rise as well. I feel like, again, mentioning COVID, but like I think having COVID and we weren't really doing as much socializing in groups and now I'll put all back into that. I mean, I know that was a long time ago now, but people do still find social situations like anxiety inducing and stressful, and I think we're in a comparison culture, and I think that also adds to stress. So taking those moments before you go to an event, or when you're walking to see a friend, or when you're walking to meet someone, to breathe is probably really, really helpful to calm yourself down. And one of my questions was going to be like, I feel like it's becoming more of a common wellness practice now, breathwork. Like I'm hearing it a lot more. You have breathwork classes and breathwork sessions. And I think, why do you think it is becoming a bit more known? Because, I don't know, 10 years ago, for example, when someone said I'm off to a breathwork session, they'd be like, what are you doing? Are you okay? Can you not breathe? Like, no one would know what that meant. But now it's like it's turning into a common practice.
Yeah, totally. And like, yeah, it's interesting that, you know, my mum's often quite an interesting marker. She's now doing breathwork, partly because I've trained in it and whatever, but it's like those things were like, you know, impossible to imagine. And I think probably a couple things that it points to, like one, I think there's just a deep like yearning from what I can see in society to like slow down and feel calmer, and also feel more connected to that part we talked about at the start of connected to self. And like in breathwork, largely there are kind of 2 main schools of it. There's like the down regulation stuff and the up regulation stuff, and like the down regulation stuff is predominantly what I teach in like day-to-day life in London, because those are the tools that you talk about. You're going into that meeting, or you're going on a date, or you're about to go and present something and you're feeling anxious. You need to get your body calm before you go in. So there are like tools we can do that just calm the body in that way and down regulate you. And then the piece that's become probably more fashionable and popular, and actually was the piece that like first drew me into breathwork, was like the up regulation stuff, which is the kind of more transformational breath. So made most famous by Wim Hof, who's obviously like, you know, kind of put breathwork on the map in many ways. And that kind of up regulation stuff in the right environments, I think is super amazing. There's probably, like with anything in wellness, like some areas it's being used because it is really like active, you know, and like for me, that upregulation stuff can give you like these insane like moments of clarity. Like I found it a really powerful decision making tool. So I was first introduced to it actually in COVID. It was that third lockdown, you know, January to April, which was it was a tricky one to cut however which way, right? The first one was sunny and the rest of it novelty. The third one was like
we're
in, right? And I was doing a lot of spoken therapy, but I found spoken therapy in that time was like largely just going around in circles, right? Because not much is shifting. And my therapist at the time was like, why don't we try some breath work? And she taught transformational breath. I'd never done it before. So with music, I'd lie down through Zoom, obviously, and she'd guide these sessions where you're going deeper in and you're doing kind of over breathing patterns through the mouth. So kind of that pattern with breath holds through a cycle, and it's a bit of a journaling, right? And it's kind of almost like some of the states you get towards are like pretty lucid and pretty out there. And I was just getting these insane moments of like clarity, kind of what I'd describe as like knowing without knowing, you know. It was just like, oh yeah, without, you know, because you're disengaging your mind. And the issue I think for so many of us is we're spending way too much time in our heads, which are great devices but are really faulty actually. And this drops you into your body, and your body never ever lies to you. And so through that I was just like, just an amazing decision making tool. And also because I was someone who like experiences episodes of depression and bits of anxiety, it's really hard to know where to make a decision. And probably for lots of us in London, right, super busy, all these inputs like on our phones, you're like discombobulated by the experience. So you need to find that like silence and stillness from which you can make like important decisions, but also like find creativity. And I think the breath just became a tool that was like super like powerful for doing that. And that I think is where like people have just wanted to get on board with it.
It makes a lot of sense, because for me, I'm not like a meditator because I can't switch off my brain. And like everyone's like, oh, just sit down and like just be with your thoughts and focus on your breathing. And like on doing that on your own, I'm like my mind is like going 100 miles an hour. Like I can't switch it off. Like how do I do this? But I think if you're really focusing on the breathing and like doing it to quite an extreme, then that's the focus, and then you kind of do get out of your head and into your body, and that does make a lot of sense. And I've heard stories where people have like cried. Like I went to an event once and I actually couldn't make the breathwork session. I came at the end. My friend was in the breathwork session and came out, and she was like having crying, and I was like, oh my god, are you okay? Like what happened in there? She was like, I have no idea what just happened. She was like, but I was uncontrollably crying. And I was like, what? And I've heard this quite a few times. And is that because, as you mentioned, like you kind of have a slight out of body experience where you stop thinking about your brain and suddenly you're so in your body that, and you have so much clarity, and you can then, is that why it happens? I think there's some quite funky things that go on, right? I've been in like groups where I'm facilitating with some teachers who have, you know, maybe 50, 100 people in the room, and like it is, they're big, like somewhere between like massive cathartic experiences and what looks probably like an orgasm type kind of pieces going on. And so it's quite out there. And as a bit of a like, and interestingly, as a teacher, I was less drawn to that area because it's like there's a lot of ego in that space, right? And there's elements of like Jesus complex because you're going around, right? And people are having these like quite big things. But then equally on the flip side, some people aren't experiencing anything at all because they're struggling to drop in. But like from a scientific standpoint, what's happening is called transcendental hyperfrontality, which sounds a bit funky, but in like reality, you're basically over breathing, and the process of over breathing is like starving your brain a bit of oxygen to obviously a safe, hopefully, level. But over a sustained period, what that does is like the prefrontal cortex, which is like the gateway to our subconscious, so like our dreamlike states, kind of the guards to that basically fall asleep because they've too much carbon dioxide, not enough oxygen, they've gone to sleep. And that process, if people kind of understand it and get into it,
is where they can drop into these states, and that's often then where they're just meeting things they're not expecting. So like, as I say, I don't teach that as much anymore, but when I was teaching that, particularly one-to-one, people would go in expecting, oh, I'm going to take this work decision, right? And then they would meet like, I don't know, someone who's like died in their life, who they're particularly close to, and they're like, whoa, I wasn't expecting that. And like, because it sat in the subconscious. And so often that experience, and often they say like the breath gives you not what you want, but what you need. So that's probably where a lot of that kind of, like those kind of big releases come from. And where people probably just meet something they weren't expecting. And then also the collective. So when you're maybe breathing with like 50 people in a room with music, naturally there's like a human energy that like adds an additional layer. If there are facilitators, we might use like touch on different parts of the body. So like to release emotions that we know are stored in different ways. So like, for instance, quite a lot concentrating around like the sternum, the seat of like control here. So like even those little things in that like heightened state of touch can like lead to these releases. I'd say
it's
like
insane actually when you think about it. Like everyone's always like, what can I take, or what do I need, or like what should I do to get to these decisions? And actually your body can tell you everything. You don't need to do anything. It's just actually all in the power of the body. The body is actually so powerful, we don't even realise.
Insanely smart. And I think the caveat is I am, as I say, a bit alluded to, like some of the like ego that's like into it, and naturally humans just are seeking stuff, right? That's why we've got interested in ayahuasca and psilocybin and things, and like, so they want to use the breath as something like this. So there's a little bit that I caveat around that. And then also I'm very mindful of saying that kind of breath pattern isn't for everyone actually. Like you need quite a well organized nervous system ideally going in, because it's quite a dysregulating breath, because it's super active and it's through the mouth, and like, as I say, like it can be quite destabilizing. So most of the work I do is spent around just getting people to have really good like function to their breath and really well organized nervous systems, and then from that place you can do some of the work. I guess it's like if people go on, I don't know, a mushroom retreat without the real stability under their feet in their life in that moment, like maybe you're not in the position for it. But,
completely. And do some people fundamentally just breathe wrong? Like, is that a thing where you're like, you just don't breathe properly?
Yeah, and myself included probably. Like,
really?
I mean, I've seen statistics, they reckon about 90% of the population are breathing incorrectly in the like Western world, kind of on the basis that a few big shifts have like happened, and the world's like changed a bit. Like diet was a massive one. So there was quite an interesting study actually in the Shetland Islands, which was like one of the last places in the like UK to make a shift in terms of diet towards like ultra processed kind of foods and sugars and the rest of it. And they found that after that shift, they had the first generation of mouth breathers on the island that came through. So like the diet means like we were kind of chewing a lot less, so our mouths weren't forming as much. And it goes all the way back, interestingly, to like babies. So ideally a baby will breastfeed. I know that's not always possible for everyone, but when you're breastfeeding versus a bottle, like you're having to use your mouth a lot more. So like you're engaging your mouth at a young age. So quite a lot of kids were bottle feeding, no effort required, so not much work, and then they go straight from that to like largely pureed foods. So like I was saying to like, I don't know, my brother and sister who both have kids, like go on, get them working, get them chewing, because you want it to form these nice big maxillas like that allow your space in your face to open up, that mean your nasal pathways can open. But so we were having like smaller kind of faces effectively. Our tongues were like sat on the bottom of our mouth rather than like up in the top, that like forced that growth a bit. And they had this skull study, lots of it's in that brilliant book by James Nestor, you know, Breath, that lots of people read. But they had these studies where suddenly there was a point where our teeth were no longer straight. So we used to have enough space in our like faces for all our teeth, and they've got narrower as like our diet has changed. We've become much more sedentary. We're like less fit than we were, you know, as a species. We're meant to be moving way more than we are. So suddenly all these really foreign like kind of lifestyle patterns are existing, and it's showing up in our breath, because eventually we just didn't have the space and we were lazy, and suddenly we became mouth breathers. And
it's fascinating.
Yeah.
What's your thoughts on mouth tape?
I use mouth tape every night. It's it's becoming more common. When I've been doing it for a couple of years, and it was actually on my Hinge profile, I put that, like, as a bit of a gag, 2 truths and a lie. And one of them was like, I tape my mouth shut at night. People would be like, what the? But now it's a bit more commonplace. And yeah, I think largely I'm on board with it. Although recently I've been like, I would quite like to go to a sleep clinic, because I think there's just quite a lot in the sleep patterns that, like, around snoring, around sleep apnea, and like some people, there's a slight argument with the mouth taping that, like, people find themselves half trying to breathe through their mouth even with the tape on, and getting these like kind of like trapped like breaths, as it were. So in the main, it's improved my sleep massively, but I would be quite interested, because it is a bit of a like unprofessional, like, self kind of correction by loads of us, right?
Do you think it's affected your breathing in the day as well? Like, it's improved the way you breathe?
And I work quite hard on my breathing, so like I would like to get better, because I've realized, because I understand the like mechanics of breath, that we want to be breathing like LSD, so light, slow and deep, so I trained with a guy called Patrick McKeown, who's founded the Oxygen Advantage. He's like the king scientist of all science of breathing, like he knows everything, and he has this LSD breathing. So he's like, we should be breathing light, we should be breathing slow, and we should be breathing deep. Because if you think the worst kind of breath would be like, if there were 2 runners going up the hill, one of them is like kind of breath, and one is, and like the way it's working your system, if you imagine like a piston going up and down in your chest, it's super easeful when you're breathing lighter, slower and deeper. But I'm wary that, like, I'm just conscious that I have to work quite hard at that. I'm not that good a natural breather, and also it's stressful. Like, most of us are breathing like 12 to 14 breaths a minute in London. That's like super fast. That means our breath's like never getting below our chest, really. And the optimum breath is like 6 breaths a minute. So it's like a lot slower. So it comes back to that like moment rich. I'm like, a couple times a day, can you just slow your breath down? You know, even for 5 minutes, 30 breaths, it's not much. At 5 seconds in and 5 seconds out. And that will just slow your breathing. And then little things like, I'll bring breath holds in when I'm walking up the street, because like, what breath holding does is gets you kind of more comfortable with carbon dioxide, and that is basically the crux of it. So if you're comfortable with carbon dioxide building up in your body, you're going to be breathing slower, because it's like the build up of carbon dioxide rather than the absence of oxygen that is the stimulus to breathe. So when people are really anxious, they have a super low tolerance to carbon dioxide. So as it builds up, the message goes from the brain to the body, take a breath. And that cycle has become really short. Maybe they had something they experienced in their life that causes panic, you know, or they've just got a long kind of relationship with anxiety, and that will just show up in their breath pattern, because their body will hate carbon dioxide. So with those people, I'm kind of literally really gently training them to get comfortable with carbon dioxide. So we do kind of breath holding that allows them just to get more used to it, and gradually you're creating a bit more space in the breath, and then naturally they're breathing a bit slower. And when you're breathing slower, your whole body's calmer, your nervous system's organized, you're just thinking clearer, but it's all obviously unconscious, because it happens without us knowing.
Really interesting. One thing I did this weekend, actually, and I was just thinking about it just now, and I didn't do it for this reason, but I went on a run without my AirPods.
Okay.
And I was really nervous about doing it. I didn't do it for any other reason than my AirPods were at my friend's house. Like, it wasn't some kind of challenge.
Right, okay.
But I was like, wanted to go on a run, didn't have them, I was like, let's go without. And I was like, this is going to be tough. And it wasn't a short run either, it was a long run, so just me and my head.
What do you normally listen to, music? Or?
Music. So and it's just like distraction, just keeps you motivated. And so it was just me and my thoughts and my breath. That's all I had to like distract myself.
Shit, man.
And it was honestly like the first 5k I was like get me out of here, this is really boring, I'm tired, I don't want to do it, like all the negative thoughts. And then after that I was like, this is amazing. Like all you're thinking about is you can hear your breath, because normally you can't even hear your breath. You could hear it. You were just way more conscious of what you were doing, and it was so much more like a meditation than a run. And it was great. Like it was so good. So if anyone listening is like, I couldn't, I don't know, focus on my breath for too long, I'd get distracted, going on a run, it doesn't have to be long, but going on a run just without any music is actually a really good way to like tune in and like focus on your breath, 100%. Focus on how you're feeling, on all those things. So and
I say the same also on like, you know, a walk as well. It's like, can you leave your phone at home and go and do, you know, a loop of Battersea Park just here, right? And in that process, naturally you're engaging your senses in a different way, right? You have to use your sight and your smell, and you're present to the moment. I remember there was a great, it wasn't like it was before the time of memes, but there's a photo of a platform in London, and there was like 8 people glued to their phones, right? And one person just like staring at the sky, and it was like, what the hell's this guy looking at? The world. And it is like such a perfect capture of like, where we've all become, right? We can't, we don't want any moment that is not filled, and so that process of doing that is so healthy. It's a bit unnatural. Well, it's actually totally natural, but feels a bit weird at first. But.
Yeah, it does. And like, I'm so aware of it. I'm constantly on my phone, like probably similar to you. Like your work's on your phone as well. So wherever you are, I'm constantly, my phone's always there. And whenever I go on a dog walk now, I'm always like, right, let's just let this be the time for me, dog, no phone, like keep the phone in your pocket. I don't do it every time, but sometimes I'm always like, oh, but like it's just too easy, but it's so true, just to like connect with your surroundings, people, look around, like look at the trees, look up, also look up, like I once did this, sounds really weird, but I was walking in London and I looked up and I was like, oh my god, like there's so much around, but sometimes we're so looking down all the time, we forget to like look up and see like what's around us. I want to touch on Qigong, because this is a term I'd never heard of before. So what is this, and how is it related to like breath work and connection?
Not many people have heard of Qigong, actually. No one ever knows how to spell it. It's quite tricky.
It's a Q.
Qigong. Qigong. To be honest, I wasn't aware of it until about just over a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago. So I was teaching breath work, which I enjoyed, but I always wanted a movement practice, because I think as a kid, like I grew up on a farm, and my natural nature was like I made sense of the world in motion and in movement, which is why I have also like loved walking, and like in that motion, like the world made more sense, you know. Whereas as you talked to earlier, like sit down, empty your mind, like quite tricky, and so while I enjoyed guiding breathwork, I found it quite stationary. And so I was just half on the lookout, and I went to a session with a teacher called Aaron, who teaches in Bath. Who's wicked. I actually threw millimeters to mountains, who I know we're going to chat about. And just immediately it was like a light bulb moment of like, oh wow, this is the practice. Because as kind of I learned more about it, first, I guess I fell in love with the philosophy of it. So it comes from the school of Chinese medicine, and like I've always been quite interested in Eastern wisdoms. Like I studied Buddhism, like I gently kind of move towards like Buddhist philosophies in my life if I can. And Chinese, they always say like Western medicine's really good for keeping you alive, and Eastern medicine's really good for keeping you healthy. So like Western medicine looks at like the symptoms, you know, cut that out, inject that, take this, whatever, can be really useful. Eastern medicine looks at the body as like a whole, and when they were developing Chinese medicine, which includes like Qigong, acupuncture, herbology, massage, lots of different parts of it, they were living completely in rhythm with the natural world. So they would like wake up with the sun, go to sleep with the moon, they would eat seasonal produce, like all their health was naturally in rhythm with what the world was telling them. And obviously as we got further from that, we've just become completely disconnected. And as a kid on the farm, I was always quite close to the seasons. You know, you understood them because you felt them. But in London, despite, maybe the temperatures when you go out, but like it's quite easy to not really know what time of year it is. And we move at the same pace, if not quicker, in December than we move at in like July, when we have like way less energy reserves in our body. So that's when everyone ends up getting super sick, right? And you're like hanging on till Christmas. And so that understanding of the seasonality was what underpinned it. And then the movement practice on top of it is Qigong, which is like the less famous sibling of Tai Chi. So most people kind of know Tai Chi, but similar principles, that you use your breath, your body and your mind to allow your energy to flow through your body. So Qi means energy or life force, and there's like a physical understanding of Qi, which is like the fact we have nerve endings and blood flow, we're magnetic. All these things contribute to our energy, right? And some days you just have that energy in abundance, and other days you just don't. And we're kind of all aware of it, because if you've walked into a room, right, and you're like, whoa, I'm not sure about that person's energy, like instinctively, they've never said anything, or you're just drawn to them, you want to come in close to them. And so like that energy, we all have energy fields that are around us. And actually Aaron was teaching me recently, but he said that these two like kung fu masters would come together, and before they would even fight, they would have a fight with their energy fields. So they'd stand opposite each other, and then one of them at that point might back down and be like, no chance. So it's like that understanding that we have energy. And then Gong means like work or skill. So this idea of like working with our energy. And the principles of it that underpin it is this idea that stagnation is like the root of illness. So if we get physically stuck on something in our bodies, like we spend too much time sedentary, we get really stuck, tension gets stuck in our bodies, we get ill, there's disease at that point. Or if we get emotionally stuck on something in our life, you've had something that just is recurring and you can't move past it, that again creates disease, because it's really unnatural to get stuck, because the natural world is always in motion and always in flux. And so if you trying to be resistant and stuck to that, is kind of what underpins that. And if I think of like the unhappiest periods of my life, all of them were populated by me freezing and being stuck and not allowing flow. So the movement practice of Qigong is kind of this idea that if we find flow in our bodies, we're better able to find flow in the rest of our life.
Okay, interesting. And it's guided, isn't it? So, and is it like, are you moving, and how does it work?
It's moving, although quite a few of the practices were like underpinning it as a breath practice similar to yoga, and then you will use movements that relate. So I teach a Qigong called 12 Rivers Qigong, which works with the organs in the body. So we will be kind of massaging the organs through different movements.
I had a lady on the podcast last week about lymphatic drainage, and a lot of what she was saying is kind of linking to this. Like we always think about like what to bring in, and like whether it's what we're eating or like what we're doing, like everything's in, but also out is just as important. Like what are you releasing, like getting rid of blockages, like all those kind of things. It's so important. Like we're always looking at what we can bring on board, but what about what you can get rid of as well? Like you've got to think of both, which is quite interesting.
We have a finite capacity, right? Otherwise we're just going to be completely overwhelmed by it.
Yeah, completely. So I want to touch on cold water therapy, because I feel like this is another wellness practice that again focuses on breathing massively. What are your kind of thoughts on it? And I mean, I've done it a few times and I love it. I really do. I think I find it easier than like turning the shower to cold. For me, that's hard, because you had hot, you've got the two extremes.
Do you do that a bit?
No, I try. I want to, but I'm just like no. I'm like, I'm not great in the cold. Like just generally, I get cold really easily. I just don't like cold. But I find it easier to get straight into something completely cold rather than having it go from hot and gradually get worse. Like that's just horrible. Whereas like getting into an ice bath or going like cold swimming, I'm like, I find that easier, and you do feel insane after. Like that day, you feel like you've just got like a new battery in you. It's like it was incredible. So how do you use it in your kind of like wellness practices?
I'm a total addict. Like, I mean, I couldn't order anything, but if I had to put number one for like my mental health, I would say cold water. Like I just in the last few years, obviously there's been a massive craze, right, coming out of COVID, and in some ways we're kind of like probably a little bit behind like some of the Scandi countries who've been like understanding the value of that, and they pair it a lot with saunas, and you're seeing a lot of saunas coming in, right, that kind of give you that like ice and fire feeling. And I mean, the science is getting there and catching up and just showing for like immune health, for blood flow, for loads of our bodily systems, it's good. It's got to be done safely. Like we are seeing examples of just people like slightly not understanding it, so the risks of like cold water shock and not warming up your body, spending too long in the water. So those things, I run the London chapter of icebreakers, and so through icebreakers we've had like training around it, so that we prepare the bodies by doing like a warm in and then a warm out, so that we're leaving people kind of warm as you come out of it, because otherwise a lot of people were going in, coming out shivering all day at their desks and going, I didn't really enjoy that, right?
I've had that one.
Yeah, exactly. So we're like, how do we properly warm the body? We do it with our breath, and we do it with movements that mean the core of our body is super warm as we go into water, and then warmed up as we go out as well. But I think just for like the clarity of it, I love it, and like the aliveness. Often when either I've just been in a difficult like period, you can become quite numb, and quite like disconnected from your body, and I would say the cold water is one of the fastest ways of just dropping me into my body, like
definitely. It's like such a shock system, like it's so good, and you do naturally have, it takes your breath away, so you have to focus on your breath to kind of get it back. But it is amazing. I once did it, and I felt like I genuinely was in the Titanic. I was like, I am so cold. But that's when I was so cold for ages afterwards. But touching on icebreakers, that is like a men's kind of like mental health group. Let's touch on men's mental health, because I do feel like, as a woman who's had her own business and works for herself, I know from experience there's so many like girl groups and female founder groups, and girls are great at like checking in, being there for each other, voice notes. I mean, God, we like have constant podcasts going on between my friends. Like, we're really good at speaking, we're really good at going for coffee catch-ups, breakfasts, but for guys, I know just from my brother, for example, if I was like to him, Bud, let's go for coffee, he'd be like, why? And I'm like, okay. So like, it's just not normal. Like, it's just not as normal maybe to check in. People guys are a lot more closed. And I don't think as a result of that there are as many guy groups, and that is actually quite interesting. So what's your kind of thoughts on all that?
I think there's like very clearly like a significant issue with it around, and it's probably been there for a long time, I suspect, like, but I've obviously become more aware of it in recent times, and like my understanding that like on a planetary level, like the world really needs like men who are able to drop into like their feminine like side, and it's not really so much about gender, but it needs that like feminine energy, which means the ability to like be vulnerable and feel safe for being vulnerable. And like I went to an all boys boarding school, which like was the antithesis of that kind of environment, because they taught you to suppress emotions, and because that allowed the school to function, right? If you had loads of kids walking around crying all the time, it's not useful. So they're like, swallow that down, and as you swallow that emotion, it lives somewhere in the body, and you suppress it, and you begin to develop these like this like armor, these defense mechanisms that allow you to like supposedly survive and then maybe thrive in this world. And what allowed you to survive perhaps in that environment actually doesn't serve you when you get to an adult form, because you're seeing like massive cases of loneliness, like if not physically but feeling lonely, because they're not able to understand what's going on in themselves, and don't have the environments to like share it. And a lot of it is a language, a lot of the men's, like, not men's groups actually, those are the kind of movement that's allowing it, but like groups of men, a lot of it's based on kind of banter and bravado, and that serves up to a point, like chatting about the rugby or the football or whatever it is. But where are you having those like nourishing men to men like conversations that say, I'm not feeling great for this reason, and it's that process you said of checking in. And so with Icebreakers, it's like a men's like group based around cold water. So we meet in London every Wednesday morning up in Hampstead. We do some Qigong and some breath work, we have a swim, and then we have a coffee and a check-in. And it's like that simple building the habit of saying, you know, this is going on in my life and it's okay to do that. And I'm seeing more and more groups, luckily, in that space coming up. But yeah, the world needs it, because it took me over 30 years to realize before I'm like, shit, man, you can't swallow that.
Yeah, it's a massive educational piece for both men and women, because men need to remove the ego out of it and not feel like they have to be a man as they've been told to be all their life.
Yeah.
And then girls also need to not expect guys to always be a man, if that makes sense. So it's an education piece from both sides, because I feel like boys' boarding school was so interesting, and I went to a girls' boarding school, and like I've spoken about this quite a lot on the podcast before, and I have so many thoughts on boys' schools, girls' schools, and my school had a boys' school and a girls' school, and how we were both treated so differently is so interesting.
Really?
And like there's pros and cons. I loved school, so I'm like all here for like the girls' school, the boys' school, it's all great, but like as two separate schools, the way they were both run and the way that we were both treated is just like completely different.
Really?
And it was the same school, but just one was for boys and one was for girls. Like, for example, girls did their own washing, boys got their washing done for them. Girls had individual dining rooms, so you'd all come together as a house and you'd all have your food together. Boys, massive big dining hall. Like, it was just even small things like that was just so different. And like the boys had to wear a suit, the girls, it was way more relaxed. And like just small things that make a massive difference. But it is so interesting. And I do think that even as the movement is changing and guys are opening up more, some girls don't want that.
Exactly.
And that's also quite an interesting part of it. It's like, well, why do you feel like you can be vulnerable and they can't?
Yeah.
Like, it's a whole
What's the role
thing.
of a man in this world, in this day and age, you know? It's
Definitely.
And
I think it's interesting because like there's a lot of like female empowerment going on, where it's like, be a girl boss and be this and be that and like earn your own money and like be powerful. But then if a guy was like, what about if I want to be more vulnerable and more emotional? It's like, no. Like, so hold on, how come they can be more, girls can be stronger and more dominant, but guys can't be, you know? It's funny how so we're definitely on a journey to finding the balance, and there is a balance, but I think that guys suppress so much emotion, and I think that's and I've definitely found like modeling vulnerability is the key, like how you can show up, and as I say, it doesn't need to be like the entire experience, but there needs to be room for it. Like, I'm very happy, as I say, bantering about the cricket and having fun and whatever, but like, is there enough space for that? And like, growing up, I always felt naturally more comfortable in female friendships. I had a lot of really close female friendships because I was allowed to be slightly softer and allowed to like let that kind of child within me have space and be a bit playful and a bit silly, and and there's just like not necessarily enough space for that. And the other piece I'd say with Icebreakers is actually having rituals. I've noticed having like, since like the church has kind of started to be like less of a central pillar to the UK, like the loss of rituals, it's quite interesting around that. And like having that rhythm of a weekly ritual for each of us is massive. So you know on Wednesday you're going to be seen and held by a community, and like without that you can feel kind of quite disconnected, as it were. True. And I also think being around people who are also open to opening up. I think the worst thing is like if you start being vulnerable and it's not received, then you're put off.
That's such a bad feeling.
And it's similar like when you learn a language, for example, and then you try it out and like you speak a different language to someone and they laugh at you. It's like, well, now I don't want to learn French anymore because you just laughed at my pronunciation or whatever. It's a similar thing. It's like you open up and then suddenly someone's laughing at it or not receiving it as you wanted to be received, and then you're like, I'm embarrassed, I don't want to talk about this anymore.
Totally.
And it like knocks you back like 10 steps.
You're right, you've got to create the safety for that and the right vulnerability, because there's been times where you've probably shared something and you're like, wow, it feels almost like you've been used or violated, or like you're like, wow, that person actually didn't deserve or wasn't ready for that level of vulnerability. And so definitely, like, there was a period when I had like a chapter I was really struggling in, you know, it's all over you, you're sharing it everywhere in your life and you're getting that feeling a lot, and you're like, actually, as you gather yourself a little bit more and you feel a bit calmer, you're like, I know now I can be vulnerable in the right spaces, in the safe spaces, and other times I can go, no, I'm all okay, even if that's not the reality, but just allows me to function. So some of those defense mechanisms that I developed at a young age are still useful to allow me to operate in day-to-day life, but I've got to be aware of them so that I can put them down at times.
Definitely. I think it's definitely a journey where like it's an education piece for everyone, and I think it is getting a lot better. And even people talk, like even having this conversation now, like people probably wouldn't have had this conversation 8 years ago. So it's definitely becoming more of a thing, which is great, because I think it is crazy how it has been so like, be a man, like don't cry like a girl, like all these kind of phrases that we know. It's like, wow, this is actually not good. So,
and, you know, right to the root of like, you know, 12 men a day in the UK taking their own lives. So like, and that's obviously the extreme end, which is incredibly sad, but the ripple effect up of that like goes a long way up to like just a lot of men who are mentally not very fit because they've had to take some kind of role. But it is, it's tricky. I also find it quite hard in some of those all male environments. It's interesting that I do men's work almost as much for a lesson for me, because as I mentioned, I felt safer in those female environments. So getting comfortable in all men where there's like a lot of ego, quite a lot of energy, quite a lot of masculinity, I'm like, oh wow, that can be difficult environments to sit in as well.
Definitely. So let's touch on your overall health and wellness journey. So how has that been? Where are you now? How's your journey in like health and wellness been?
Probably like where has it been? Probably like lots of people, it's like not linear, right? But there was a moment, I would say, around my kind of 29th, 30th birthday, like if you're into astrology, like classic Saturn's return kind of point, where there was a very clear shift that like altered the direction of my life. And I think up until that point, I had made predominantly decisions based on my mind. So I've made like rational decisions, things that I thought were the right things to do, that like that were kind of kind to others, lots of these things that I thought were right. And there was a moment where I was sat in Philips, a big corporate in the Netherlands, where I had like super well paid job that looked good on paper. I had a wicked girlfriend at the time, a flat, all these things like that. I ticked all the boxes, and I was in the canteen and I was crying, and I was like, wow. And it had been a series of what felt like small decisions, but they had created a life that was like just slightly out of alignment for me. And if you imagine you kind of make that slight decision that sets you off at one point, you end up actually a really long way from that point of alignment. And that was a moment of realization that I had to make like massive changes. I had to like reprogram what it meant to be me, and that meant like making decisions that technically were selfish. So I had to learn how to like hurt people a little bit, but in the way that was truthful to me, you know, because actually you were hurting people in your life way more by suppressing those things. So it was like a big shift and the main shift was I went from my head to making decisions based on my body. So lots of those somatic practices we talked about started to come into my life, and they were the ones I made decisions on. So like based on my intuition, right or wrong, at least it felt right to me. And then probably the big like wake up was that was an episode of depression, and I'd never had experienced depression before, but like a deep like feeling to my core of depression. And that would, to me, in my mind, was just my body telling me you're out of alignment. And I've actually come to learn that my episodes of depression are like incredibly useful, like lighthouses almost, like telling me that I'm close to the cliffs and we need to make a change. And nearly always I know what that change is, because it feels quite kind of episodic. It wasn't something I experienced as a kid. It feels like it was something that was happening to me, and that became a real kind of guiding like barometer for like direction. And it was a really hard process because you have to break everything down, but I started making decisions that were based on intuition, and that was a major shift, and kind of probably led me to like turn my life like in a different direction to where I'm sat here today.
That's so brave though, because so many people would have been like, oh well, I'm here now, so I can't do anything about it. And like, to listen to your body that much is really good as well. Like I always talk about listening to your body, and like we always look elsewhere for answers, but our body's got all the answers. That's like we mentioned earlier. Like, and it's so brave to be able to be like, this doesn't feel right, I need to do something about it.
And you always know, even in that, it was really hard. In the depths of it, you feel like you can't get out of this situation, right? It feels massive. And actually, for a lot of that, and for a lot of people, I think, I just didn't want to hear anything, because even letting the slightest thing in meant I had to question my entire identity. So a lot of people are just numbed off, I think, because you're like, if I let a chink in, that potentially means I have to rip it all up. And that's what I had to do. But it was always in the depths of the night. You would like look in the mirror, and like you can lie to the whole world, but I couldn't lie to myself. Like you look in the mirror and you just know it's not there. And even though now, like probably lots of what I've done and my life in many ways doesn't necessarily make sense, and it's a learning journey, at least it's always felt in alignment. And that was the big shift. I was like, wow, you have to give voice, and like it's really hard to own your voice, but you have to learn to. And actually one of the Qigong moves we do is like a lion's breath, and they do it a little bit to get you practicing owning your voice. So you do like, you have your hands on your knees, you do like a lion. And I always do it with corporates, because there's a lot of suppression right in the corporates, and we're all like trying to pretend that we've got all our shit together, but none of us do. We're all making it up, right? It's like a breath that gets you to be a bit silly and gets you that practice of saying like, this is who I am and this is my place in the world. And I'm really grateful that in many ways that I had that kick to learn it at 30, because I see lots of people, my parents' age, maybe in their 70s, are never going to. And actually I understand, you're so deep in at that point. Fuck, it's hard. And I have such admiration if they're prepared to later in life. But it never is too late. And I think lots of my work is to encourage people that it's okay that they're feeling like that, and they're okay to follow that, even if it's going to create change in their life. It's the right move.
Even at 30, some people would say, like, I can't, it's too late.
Yeah.
And like, we're constantly evolving, and decisions you made when you were 16, 18, 20 is not necessarily going to be the decisions that you want to make when you're 30. Like, you're always changing.
Totally.
So it's never too late to change your mind, or to move as your body is telling you to move, or to go in a different direction. But it's so scary.
It's the fear. You're right. And it's that place just beyond the fear, like to rip up my life from that point is so full of fear, and everything in your mind is telling you all these things, but it's actually the place just beyond the fear where like the alignment and where so much of the joy exists for you. But fuck, it's hard to.
So hard.
Susan David has it. She was like, courage. She's a like psychologist in America, and I'll get her quote wrong, but it's something like, courage is not the absence of fear, it's fear walking. So this idea that like we're always gonna have fear, it's like natural in our brain, it's deep in our core, and we have to get used to just walking gently towards it. Like so much you see of imposter syndrome and all those things that just cause us just to retreat and shut down. And it's that practice. It's like a muscle, and the more we do it, the more comfortable we get.
But it's how you grow as well. Like, if you don't get into fear situations, you're never going to grow, or something that doesn't feel quite right. Like if you're constantly in the comfortable, you're never going to grow, because the uncomfort is what kind of helps you grow.
Fuck, it's uncomfortable.
Definitely, but that is amazing. To finish off, I have a final question.
Sure.
And it's actually bringing it all back to food again.
Okay.
And I always ask people this because I think I love it, which is, what would your last meal be? Starter, main course and dessert.
My death row meal.
Basically,
Yeah, difficult. I reckon I would go probably for like a calamari type start, really good calamari. You're sat by the sea. I always feel at my happiest by the ocean. That kind of piece. And then I'm gonna probably have a really good and simple pasta dish, a bit like we talked about earlier, but like that just and you could something like a kind of cacio e pepe, just simple pasta. And then for pudding, it would always be sticky toffee pudding, but interestingly I've been getting it's the Italian thing again, into tiramisu, and like a really well made tiramisu maybe to finish.
We've gone full Italian.
I've gone pretty much Italian there.
Nice. Love that. Simon, thank you so much for coming on. It's been so interesting to talk about like listening to the body, connecting with the body, because as I mentioned to start off with, we are so disattached to that now. And I think we're so on our phones, digital, on to the next, and just kind of the power of checking in and listening to your body and listening to your breath and tuning into all of that is so powerful. And as we've kept saying, our body has all the answers. We've just got to find out how to listen to it. So thank you for sharing your experiences, because it's been great.
No worries. Thanks so much for having me, Georgia.